The bailiff's voice trembled with uncertainty. "Would you please repeat what you just said?" The packed courtroom fell into a sudden hush. Every creak of the wooden benches seemed amplified in the silence as all eyes turned toward the witness stand where 14-year-old Sophie Miller sat, her hands gripping the edges of her chair. Her school backpack rested against her leg, the faded NASA patch her mother had sewn on last year barely visible beneath the wooden railing. "I said." Sophie's voice was quiet but remarkably steady. "My mother is innocent. And I can prove who really stole that money." A wave of whispers rippled through the courtroom. Judge Harmon leaned forward, his silver-rimmed glasses catching the light as he studied Sophie with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. The prosecutor, Ms. Daniels, stood frozen mid-stride, her red-soled heels suddenly silent on the polished floor. Sophie's mother, Eliza Miller, seated at the defense table in a simple navy suit that had grown loose on her frame during her weeks in detention, covered her mouth with trembling hands, tears welling in her eyes. Even Sophie's mother's attorney, Mr. Walsh, looked stunned. He adjusted his tie nervously, clearly unprepared for this development from his young witness. He had only called Sophie to establish her mother's character, not to introduce new evidence. The silence was finally broken by Alexander Blackwood, the CEO of Meridian Investments, sitting in the front row behind the prosecution table. His tanned face darkened as he leaned toward his attorney, whispering urgently. Blackwood was a man unaccustomed to surprises, especially in a courtroom where he expected his version of events to prevail without question. Judge Harmon tapped his gavel once, gently. "Young lady, this is a very serious matter. Do you understand the gravity of what you're saying?" Sophie nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." Mr. Walsh approached the bench. "Your Honor, may I request a brief recess to confer with my witnesses?" Ms. Daniels was on her feet instantly. "Objection. This is clearly an attempt to introduce unvetted evidence. The defense has had ample time to prepare their case. I've been gathering evidence for weeks." Sophie interjected, her voice carrying surprisingly well in the tension-filled room. "Evidence that shows how Mr. Blackwood framed my mother." The whispers erupted into a chorus of gasps and murmurs. Blackwood's face flushed crimson as he stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is outrageous!" he bellowed. Judge Harmon struck his gavel with more force this time. "Order in my courtroom." He fixed Sophie with a stern but not unkind look. "Young lady, these are very serious allegations. Ms. Daniels is correct that we cannot simply introduce new evidence at this late stage without proper procedures." Sophie reached for her backpack, unzipping it with deliberate slowness. "I understand, Your Honor, but what if the evidence was deliberately hidden? What if someone made sure it wouldn't be found through proper procedures?" The judge held up his hand as Ms. Daniels began to protest again. "Mr. Walsh, did you have any knowledge of this evidence your witness claims to have?" Sophie's mother's attorney looked genuinely perplexed. "No, Your Honor, this is the first I'm hearing of it." "Because he wouldn't have believed me," Sophie said, pulling a laptop from her backpack. "No one would. I'm just a kid." 5 months earlier, Sophie's life had been almost boringly normal. She lived with her mother in a comfortable brownstone in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood. Their home was modest compared to some in the area, but the location allowed Sophie to attend Lakeside Preparatory Academy on a partial scholarship. At Lakeside, Sophie had developed a reputation as the quiet, slightly awkward computer genius who could fix anything with a circuit board and rarely volunteered answers despite usually knowing them. Sophie's father had died when she was 7, a sudden heart attack that left Eliza Miller a widow at 34. For years, it had been just the two of them, until Sophie's mother had been promoted to chief financial officer at Meridian Investments 2 years ago. The promotion had brought financial stability they hadn't known before, but also meant longer hours for her mother. As compensation, perhaps, her mother had bought Sophie her first serious computer and enrolled her in coding camps during school breaks. Sophie had taken to programming like she'd been born speaking Python and C++, quickly surpassing her instructors and finding her way into increasingly advanced online communities. That seemingly ordinary Tuesday in January began with a breakfast of slightly burnt toast. Her mother had been distracted by quarter-end reports and ended with 3 FBI agents in their living room. "Eliza Miller," the lead agent had said, his voice professionally detached as he held up his badge. "You're under arrest for wire fraud, financial institution fraud, and money laundering." Sophie had watched in horror as her mother's face drained of color. "There must be some mistake," her mother had whispered, but the agents continued reciting her rights while fitting handcuffs around her wrists. Sophie had stood frozen in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, a half-empty glass of milk clutched in her hand, unable to comprehend how her mother, who triple-checked every expense report and insisted on paying for the occasional office donut she took, could possibly be accused of stealing money. "Mom," Sophie had finally managed to say, her voice cracking. Her mother had looked at her then, fear and confusion in her eyes quickly masked by a forced calmness. "Call Aunt Patricia," she'd instructed. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart. This is just a misunderstanding." But it wasn't a misunderstanding. In the days that followed, the allegations became clear. A $37 million had disappeared from Meridian Investments' client accounts over the past 18 months. As CFO, Eliza had access to all the financial systems, and the FBI had evidence of transfers to offshore accounts apparently traced to her home IP address. Her signature was on documents authorizing certain investments that had never actually existed. The evidence seemed overwhelming, but Sophie knew with the bone, deep certainty that came from 14 years of watching her mother agonize over even the smallest financial decisions, that Eliza Miller was innocent. The first night without her mother, Sophie had stayed with her Aunt Patricia, her mother's older sister who lived in Evanston. Aunt Patricia had tried her best to be comforting, but the worried creases around her eyes told Sophie everything she needed to know about how serious the situation was. "They're saying she took $37 million. Aunt Patricia had whispered into her phone while Sophie pretended to sleep on the living room couch. "No, of course I don't believe it. But the evidence, they say it's pretty damning." The next morning, the story was splashed across the Chicago Tribune's front page. Meridian CFO arrested in massive fraud scheme. The article quoted Alexander Blackwood expressing his profound disappointment and sense of betrayal at the actions of a trusted executive. He assured Meridian's clients that the company would fully cooperate with authorities and work to recover the stolen funds. By the time Sophie returned to school the following week, everyone knew. The whispers followed her through the hallways, teachers gave her pitying looks, friends suddenly had other lunch plans. Only Olivia Chen, her best friend since 5th grade, stood by her side. "This is complete garbage," Olivia had declared, slamming her locker shut after a particularly brutal morning of avoided gazes and whispered comments. "Your mom checks restaurant bills 3 times to make sure they didn't overcharge for water. She wouldn't steal a paperclip, let alone millions of dollars." Sophie had nodded, fighting back tears. "I know, but how do we prove it?" That question became Sophie's obsession. While her mother's court-appointed attorney gathered character references and prepared a defense based largely on Eliza's spotless record and community standing, Sophie began her own investigation. It started with the basics, understanding exactly what her mother was accused of doing. Sophie spent hours in the school library after classes ended, researching financial fraud, money laundering, and white-collar crime. She learned the terminology, the methods, the digital fingerprints such crimes usually left behind. Each evening she'd visit her mother in the Metropolitan Detention Center, maintaining a forced cheerfulness during their brief meetings across a scratched plastic divider. "Mr. Walsh says we have a strong case for reasonable doubt," her mother had told her during one such visit, 3 weeks after her arrest. Eliza looked pale, the harsh lighting accentuating the dark circles under her eyes. "And the investigators still haven't found the money, which is odd for a case like this." "Because you didn't take it," Sophie had replied firmly. Her mother had smiled then, a sad, tired smile. "Of course not, sweetheart. But in these cases, well, proving a negative is always difficult. Then we need to prove a positive," Sophie had declared. "We need to find out who really did it." Her mother's expression had grown serious then. "Sophie, listen to me. I want you to focus on school and taking care of yourself. Let the lawyers handle this. Promise me you won't get involved." Sophie had promised, crossing her fingers beneath the visiting room table. The next day, she had cornered Olivia by their lockers. "I need your help," she'd whispered. "My mom's lawyer isn't looking in the right direction. He's playing defense when we need to play offense." Olivia had looked skeptical. "And what exactly do you think 2 high school freshmen can do that the FBI can't?" "The FBI is convinced they already have their criminal," Sophie had replied. "They're not looking for anyone else. But we will." Their first step had been to learn everything they could about Meridian Investments and Alexander Blackwood. Olivia, whose father was a business reporter for the Chicago Tribune, had access to news databases and financial records through her dad's home office computer. Blackwood started Meridian 15 years ago after leaving Goldman Sachs. Olivia reported after their first research session. The company grew quickly, especially in the last 5 years. They manage over $3 billion in assets now. Sophie had nodded, scrolling through articles on her own laptop. And my mom was hired 6 years ago as a senior accountant, then promoted to CFO 2 years ago after the previous CFO retired suddenly. Retired or retired? Olivia had asked, making air quotes. That's what I wondered too. Sophie had replied, opening a new search tab. Let's find out what happened to Jeffrey Hammond. The former CFO proved difficult to track down. There was little about him online after his departure from Meridian, no LinkedIn updates, no mentions in business publications. It was as if he had simply vanished. This is weird, Sophie had muttered after an hour of fruitless searching. People don't just disappear, especially high-level executives. Unless they want to, Olivia had suggested, or someone wants them to. A chill had run down Sophie's spine at her friend's words. Let's check property records, she'd suggested. If he owned a house in Chicago, maybe we can find out where he moved to. The Cook County property search revealed that Hammond had sold his Lincoln Park home 3 days after his retirement from Meridian, well below market value, in a cash transaction. That's suspicious, Olivia had noted. Who sells $1 million house that quickly for less than it's worth? Someone who's in a hurry, Sophie had replied. Or someone who's scared. Their next breakthrough came when Sophie remembered something her mother had mentioned months ago, that she'd been surprised to find herself promoted after suggesting an audit of certain investment vehicles Blackwood had personally established. She thought it was strange. Sophie told Olivia as they huddled in the back corner of the school library. Usually people who ask uncomfortable questions get sidelined, not promoted, but Blackwood had insisted she take the CFO position. Olivia had tapped her chin thoughtfully, so he wanted her in that position. Why? More responsibility, more visibility, more liability. Sophie had finished. If something went wrong, she'd be the one responsible. The pieces were starting to fit together in Sophie's mind. Blackwood had positioned her mother to take the fall for something he had been planning, but they needed proof, not just theories and coincidences. We need to get into Meridian's systems, Sophie had declared. See the actual transaction records. Olivia had stared at her. You're talking about hacking into a financial institution. That's, like, super illegal. Not hacking, Sophie had corrected. My mom's login might still work. Or her eyes had lit up. My mom brought homework sometimes. She has a company laptop they never collected. It might still be at our house. The laptop had been tucked in the back of her mother's bedroom closet, forgotten in the chaos of the arrest. When Sophie powered it on, she'd been prompted for a password. Great, Olivia had groaned. Now what? But Sophie had smiled. My mom uses variations of the same password for everything. Her fingers had flown over the keyboard, trying combinations of birthdays, their address, and Sophie's full name. On the 5th attempt, the screen had unlocked. We're in, Sophie had whispered, a mixture of triumph and trepidation in her voice. For the next few weeks, Sophie and Olivia spent every free moment analyzing the files on Eliz's laptop. Most were mundane spreadsheets, reports, presentation decks, but buried in a folder labeled Q3 Review was a series of emails between her mother and Blackwood discussing certain discrepancies in client account statements. Look at this, Sophie had said, pointing to one exchange. Mom flagged transactions to something called Orion Partners, but Blackwood told her it was a special investment vehicle for high net worth clients only. And this one, Olivia had added, scrolling down. She questioned wire transfers to Grand Cayman, and he said it was tax optimization for the same client group. Sophie had felt a surge of both vindication and anger. She was onto him. She was asking the right questions. But we still don't have proof he was behind it, Olivia had pointed out. This just shows your mom was doing her job. Sophie had nodded, thinking hard. We need to follow the money. Mom said they never found the stolen funds. If we could trace where it actually went. And then what? Olivia had asked. We can't exactly walk into the FBI with our theory. They'd want to know how we got this information. Sophie had closed the laptop, determination setting her jaw. Then we need to find a way to make them discover it themselves. The opportunity had come in the form of Meridian's annual Client Appreciation Gala, held at the Art Institute of Chicago. Sophie had overheard her aunt discussing it on the phone, how distasteful it was for Blackwood to host such a lavish event while the company was embroiled in scandal. He's acting like nothing happened, Aunt Patricia had said, like he didn't just throw Eliza to the wolves. Sophie had immediately texted Olivia, we need to go to that gala. Getting in had been surprisingly easy. Aunt Patricia worked for a catering company that often handled high-end events, and with a little persuasion, Sophie had convinced her to add their names to the staff list for the evening. "You're both on drink service," Aunt Patricia had instructed as she handed them black pants and white button-up shirts. "Stay away from Blackwood. The last thing we need is for him to recognize you and make a scene." Serving sparkling water and wine to Chicago's financial elite had not been Sophie's idea of a good Saturday night, but it gave her the perfect cover to observe Blackwood in his natural habitat. He moved through the crowd with practiced charm, shaking hands and laughing at jokes, projecting confidence and prosperity. "He doesn't look like someone who's missing $37 million, Olivia had muttered as they refilled their trays at the service station. "That's because he's not missing it," Sophie had replied. "He knows exactly where it is." As the evening progressed, Sophie had noticed Blackwood slipping away from the main gallery and heading toward the administrative offices. Making a split-second decision, she had handed her tray to Olivia and followed him at a distance. Blackwood had entered a small office and closed the door behind him. Sophie had crept closer, pressing her ear against the door. "It's all proceeding as planned," she'd heard him say, presumably on a phone call. "The trial starts next week, and the outcome isn't in doubt. Miller will take the fall, and we'll be clear to move the rest by month end." Sophie's heart had raced. This was it, confirmation of what she'd suspected all along, but without recording it, she had no proof. Just her word against his. She had been so absorbed in eavesdropping that she hadn't noticed the security guard approaching until his hand landed on her shoulder. "Restricted area, miss," he'd said sternly. "Staff needs to remain in the event spaces." Sophie had mumbled an apology about looking for the restroom and hurried back to the main gallery, her mind working furiously. Blackwood was planning to move more money once her mother was convicted. That meant the original funds were still somewhere accessible to him. By the time the gala ended, Sophie had formed a plan. It was risky, possibly illegal, and definitely something her mother would forbid if she knew. But it was also their best chance. The next morning, Sophie had sat at her desk at home, her mother's company laptop open beside her own. She'd spent hours combing through every document, every spreadsheet, looking for any mention of the mysterious Orion partners or unusual transfers. Finally, in a subfolder of archived emails, she'd found something, a confirmation of account opening from First Caribbean International Bank, addressed to Orion Partners LLC. The signatory on the account was listed as Richard Phillips. "Who's Richard Phillips?" Olivia had asked when Sophie called to share her discovery. "I don't know yet," Sophie had replied, "but I'm going to find out." A search for Richard Phillips in Chicago had yielded too many results to be useful. But when Sophie referenced the name with Meridian Investments, she'd found a single mention in a 5-year-old press release. "Richard Phillips joins Meridian as Chief Technology Officer." The CTO? Sophie had whispered to herself. He would have access to all the systems. He could create false digital trails. Further searching revealed that Phillips had left Meridian 3 years ago to pursue other opportunities. There was no information about where he had gone next. Sophie had begun to feel overwhelmed. They were uncovering pieces of the puzzle, but how could they prove any of it? How could they convince anyone to look at Blackwood and Phillips instead of her mother? The answer had come from an unexpected source. During one of her visits with her mother, Eliza had mentioned that the prosecution's case relied heavily on digital evidence, IP addresses, login records, digital signatures. "It's all circumstantial," her mother had said, "but very convincing circumstantial evidence. They have records showing my credentials were used to authorize the transfers." Sophie, who had been only half listening as she wrestled with her own investigation, had suddenly focused. "Digital records can be falsified," she'd said, "especially by someone with administrative access to the systems." Her mother had looked at her sharply. "Sophie, what are you doing?" "Nothing," Sophie had replied too quickly. "Just thinking aloud." But the seed had been planted. If Phillips, as CTO, had helped Blackwood frame her mother, he would have left digital fingerprints of his own. Not in the obvious places investigators would look, but in the background systems, the logs, the code itself. That night Sophie had made a decision. She needed to get into Meridian's actual systems, not just the files on her mother's laptop. It was time to do what Olivia had accused her of planning all along: hack into Meridian Investments. Sophie wasn't actually a hacker in the traditional sense. She was good with computers, yes, but she'd never breached a system illegally before. However, she did have one advantage. Her mother had mentioned once that Meridian used the same network management company that provided services to Lakeside Prep. The next day at school, Sophie had volunteered to help the IT department troubleshoot some network issues of frequent occurrence that the overworked school technician was always grateful for assistance with. While helping, she'd casually asked about their network management system. "Oh, we use NetSecure," the technician had told her. "Pretty standard for educational institutions. It's the same system used by a lot of businesses too, just with different security protocols." "How different?" Sophie had asked, trying to sound merely curious. "Well, the backend is essentially the same," he'd explained. "The configurations and security levels vary based on the client's needs and budget." That evening, Sophie had begun researching NetSecure's architecture, looking for any potential vulnerabilities. She wasn't planning a brute force attack, she was looking for a side door. The breakthrough came when she discovered that NetSecure had released a security patch 3 months ago for their remote access feature, a patch that, according to tech forums, many clients had been slow to implement. Sophie had created a small program to scan Meridian's external network interfaces, looking for the specific vulnerability. To her surprise and slight alarm, the scan came back positive. Meridian's IT department had not applied the patch. "I can actually get in," she'd told Olivia the next day, her voice a mixture of excitement and terror. "Should you, though?" Olivia had asked. "This is way beyond looking at your mom's work laptop. This is like federal crime territory." Sophie had bitten her lip. "I know. But what choice do I have? Mom's trial starts next week. Her lawyer is focused on character witnesses and reasonable doubt, not on finding the real criminals." After a long silence, Olivia had sighed. "What do you need me to do?" "Be my lookout," Sophie had replied, "and help me figure out exactly what we're looking for once we're in." That weekend, from the safety of her bedroom, Sophie had carefully exploited the vulnerability in Meridian's network. She'd gained access not to the core financial systems, those were behind additional firewalls, but to the company's internal network, including emails, shared drives, and most importantly, system logs. When need to find any communication between Blackwood and Phillips, Sophie had instructed as Olivia watched nervously over her shoulder. And anything about Orion Partners. It had taken hours of careful searching, moving laterally through the system while covering her tracks. Sophie had been about to give up when she spotted an archived folder in Blackwood's email labeled simply, "RP Projects." Inside were dozens of emails between Blackwood and Phillips, dating back 4 years and continuing long after Phillips had officially left the company. Many referenced the special project and asset transfers, but were frustratingly vague about specifics. Then Sophie had found an email from Phillips to Blackwood dated just 2 weeks before her mother's arrest. "Everything is in place. The digital trail leads where we discussed. Once triggered, the system will execute the scheduled transfers and create all necessary documentation with EM's credentials. Timing is critical. I can only guarantee a 72-hour window before any manual review might detect anomalies." "EM," Sophie had whispered. "Eliza Miller, my mom." Olivia had squeezed her shoulder. "This proves they set her up." But Sophie had shaken her head. "It's suggestive but not conclusive. We need more. We need to find the actual program Phillips created to frame Mom." They had spent another hour searching through system directories before locating a hidden folder on a development server. Inside was a series of scripts labeled Cleanup Protocol. Sophie had downloaded them to a USB drive, her hands shaking with anticipation. Later that night, after Olivia had gone home, Sophie had analyzed the scripts line by line. They were sophisticated, designed to create false access logs, generate backdated authorization documents, and execute financial transactions using stored credentials, in this case, her mother's. "This is it," Sophie had whispered to her empty room. "This is how they did it." But having evidence and being able to use it were two different things. She couldn't simply present illegally obtained files to the court. She needed a way to introduce this evidence legally or to lead investigators to discover it themselves. After days of consideration, Sophie had finally conceived a plan. It was audacious and depended on several factors beyond her control, but it was the best chance they had. With her mother's trial beginning that Monday, time was running out. The weekend before the trial, Sophie had composed an anonymous email to Meridian's board of directors and the FBI agents investigating the case. The email didn't include any of the files she'd discovered that would raise questions about how they were obtained. Instead, it pointed to their locations on Meridian's servers and suggested specific search terms. "I'm not revealing my identity for fear of retaliation," she'd written, "but as someone with knowledge of Meridian's operations, I feel compelled to point out that certain evidence in the Eliza Miller case appears to have been manufactured. Investigators should examine the development server folder cleanup protocol and review communication between A. Blackwood and R. Phillips regarding asset transfers and M. credentials. Sophie had sent the email through multiple anonymizing services, knowing it might be dismissed as a hoax or worse, ignored entirely. It was a gamble, but she'd had no choice but to take it. When Monday arrived and the trial began, Sophie had attended with Aunt Patricia, searching the faces of the FBI agents present for any sign that they'd followed up on her tip. She'd seen nothing to give her hope. The prosecution's opening statement had been devastating, laying out in clear, convincing detail how Eliza Miller had systematically diverted client funds, created false documentation, and attempted to conceal her actions. The evidence will show, Ms. Daniels had declared, that the defendant abused her position of trust to enrich herself at the expense of individuals and families who placed their financial futures in Meridian's hands. Sophie had watched her mother throughout this recitation, noting how she sat straight, backed and composed despite the terrible accusations. Eliza Miller would not crumble, not in public, not in front of her daughter. But Sophie had seen the slight tremor in her hands, the excessive blinking that always betrayed her mother's distress. By the third day of trial, Sophie had begun to despair. Her anonymous tip had apparently led nowhere, and the prosecution's case seemed to be proceeding exactly as Blackwood had planned. That morning, Blackwood himself had taken the stand, expressing his profound disappointment in Eliza Miller and detailing how her actions had damaged the company. During a break in proceedings, Sophie had overheard two FBI agents talking in the courthouse hallway. Something weird came in over the weekend. One had said, "Anonymous tip about hidden files at Meridian. We'll get cranks all the time." The other had replied dismissively, "Yeah." But this one was specific, mentioned people and server locations. Jeller sent a tech team to check it out, but Blackwood's counsel blocked them, said it was corporate espionage to access those servers without more specific warrants. Sophie's heart had sunk. Blackwood was one step ahead of them. That afternoon, Sophie had been called to testify as a character witness for her mother. Mr. Walsh had prepared her carefully. She was to speak about her mother's integrity, her dedication to Sophie's upbringing, her involvement in the community. Nothing controversial, nothing about the case itself. But as Sophie had taken the oath and settled into the witness chair, looking out at the courtroom, at her mother's hopeful expression, at Blackwood's smug confidence, at the jury's polite attention, something had shifted inside her. She couldn't follow the script. Not anymore. Not when she alone knew the truth. And so, when Mr. Walsh had asked his first question about what kind of mother Eliza Miller was, Sophie had taken a deep breath and said the words that silenced the courtroom. "My mother is innocent, and I can prove who really stole that money." Now facing the astonished courtroom, Sophie opened her backpack and removed her laptop. "Young lady," Judge Harmon said, his tone measured but firm, "this is highly irregular. You cannot simply introduce evidence that hasn't been properly disclosed and examined." "I understand, Your Honor," Sophie replied. But this evidence wasn't available before because Mr. Blackwood made sure of it. She turned toward the CEO, who was now conferring urgently with his attorney. He blocked the FBI from accessing the development servers when they tried to follow up on an anonymous tip this weekend. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly as he glanced toward the FBI agents seated behind the prosecutor. One of them nodded almost imperceptibly. "Ms. Daniels," the judge said, turning to the prosecutor, "are you aware of this alleged obstruction?" The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, Mr. Blackwood's counsel raised legitimate concerns about proprietary information and the scope of the existing warrants. It was a legal objection, not obstruction. It was a deliberate attempt to hide evidence." Sophie interrupted, earning a stern look from the judge. "Young lady, you will respect the procedures of this court," Judge Harmon admonished. "No, Mr. Walsh, I suggest you confer with your witness and decide how you wish to proceed within the bounds of admissible testimony." Mr. Walsh approached the witness stand, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. "Sophie," he whispered, "what are you doing? We discussed your testimony." "I know," Sophie whispered back, "but I found proof, real proof." "Mom didn't do this." "What kind of proof?" Walsh asked, his professional skepticism warring with desperate hope. "Scripts created by Richard Phillips, Meridian's former CTO, designed to frame my mother, and emails between Phillips and Blackwood discussing the plan." Walsh's eyes widened. "How did you get this information?" Sophie hesitated.
"I found it."
Understanding dawned on Walsh's face. "You hacked their system," he whispered, running a hand through his hair. "Sophie, that evidence would be inadmissible even if I tried to introduce it." "I know." Sophie admitted. But it tells us where to look. If the FBI gets the right warrants, they'll find everything themselves. Walsh straightened, turning to address the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to redirect my questioning. Proceed, Judge Harmon said, though his expression remained skeptical. Walsh cleared his throat. Sophie, you mentioned Richard Phillips earlier. How do you know that name? Sophie recognized the lifeline he was throwing her away to introduce the information without admitting how she obtained it. My mother mentioned him. Sophie said carefully. He was Meridian's chief technology officer before she became CFO. She told me he left the company suddenly. Did your mother ever mention any concerns about Mr. Phillips' work? Ms. Daniels stood. Objection. Your Honor. Hearsay. Your Honor. Walsh countered. The prosecution has built their case on the digital evidence allegedly connecting Ms. Miller to these transfers. The defense has the right to explore alternative explanations for how that evidence came to exist. After a moment's consideration, the judge nodded. I'll allow it, but tread carefully. Counselor. Walsh turned back to Sophie. Did your mother ever discuss Richard Phillips in relation to her work at Meridian? Sophie nodded. She mentioned that after he left, she found security gaps in some of the financial systems. She was working to fix them and had flagged unusual account activities to Mr. Blackwood. At the mention of his name, Blackwood shifted in his seat, his face darkening. What kind of unusual activities? Walsh pressed. Transfers to entities she couldn't verify, like one called Orion Partners. When she asked Mr. Blackwood about them, he told her they were special investment vehicles for wealthy clients and not to worry about them. Walsh nodded, appearing to consider this information. Sophie, based on your understanding, when did these conversations between your mother and Mr. Blackwood take place? In the months before she was arrested, Sophie replied. She was actually compiling a report about these discrepancies. She was worried about what she was finding. Ms. Daniels rose again. Your Honor, the witness is a 14-year-old child speculating about financial matters far beyond her comprehension. This testimony has no probative value. I'm not speculating, Sophie insisted. My mother showed me some of what she found because she was proud of her attention to detail. That's how I know she was investigating accounts like Orion Partners, which happens to be registered in the Cayman Islands with Richard Phillips as the signatory. A murmur ran through the courtroom. One of the FBI agents leaned forward, suddenly more interested. Judge Harmon tapped his gavel. Ms. Daniels, Mr. Walsh approached the bench. As the attorneys conferred with the judge in hushed tones, Sophie glanced at her mother, who was staring at her with a mixture of pride and terror. Sophie gave her a small, reassuring nod. After a few moments, the judge addressed the courtroom. In light of this testimony, I'm ordering a 30-minute recess. Ms. Daniels, I suggest you confer with your investigative team about these allegations. Mr. Walsh, I expect you to advise your young witness about the seriousness of making such claims in my courtroom. We'll reconvene at 11:45. As the judge exited the courtroom, Blackwood rose and strode quickly toward the doors, his attorney hurrying to keep pace. Sophie watched him go, noting the tension in his shoulders, the urgency in his steps. He's worried, she whispered to herself. Good. During the recess, Walsh pulled Sophie into a small conference room, with Eliza and Aunt Patricia joining them. Sophie Miller, her mother began, her voice trembling with emotion. What have you done? Sophie met her mother's gaze. What no one else was doing. Mom, I found proof that Blackwood and Phillips set you up. Eliza shook her head in disbelief. Sophie, what have you gotten yourself into? How did you? She stopped herself, clearly not wanting to know the answer. This isn't your responsibility. You're my child. I'm supposed to protect you, not the other way around. Somebody had to do something. Sophie insisted. Mr. Walsh was building a defense based on your character, but Blackwood was too many steps ahead. He's been planning this for years. Walsh cleared his throat. Sophie, I need to know exactly what you found and how you found it. Right now, all we have is your testimony about things your mother allegedly told you. That's not enough to derail the prosecution's case. Sophie took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth. I can't tell you how I found it, she admitted, but I know that there's a folder on Meridian's development server called a cleanup protocol that contains scripts designed to create false trails using my mom's credentials. And there are emails between Blackwood and Phillips discussing using AM credentials to execute transfers. Walsh looked troubled. Sophie, if you obtained this information illegally. I didn't say that, Sophie interrupted. I'm just telling you where to look. The FBI can get proper warrants now that they have specific information. It's not that simple, Walsh explained. The prosecution won't pursue a new line of investigation based solely on the uncorroborated testimony of a 14-year-old girl with an obvious motive to protect her mother. Sophie's frustration mounted. Then what was the point of all this? I found the truth and no one will even look. Aunt Patricia, who had been listening silently, suddenly spoke up. What about Richard Phillips? Have you actually found him? Sophie shook her head. No, he seems to have disappeared after leaving Meridian. Then find him, Aunt Patricia suggested. If he's the key to all this, and he's out there somewhere spending stolen millions, there must be a way to track him down. Sophie's eyes widened as an idea took shape. That's it, she whispered. We don't need to prove how I found the evidence. We need to find Phillips and get him to testify. Walsh looked skeptical. In the next 20 minutes, no, Sophie conceded, but maybe we can buy some time. She turned to her mother. Mom, do you remember anything about Phillips? Friends, family, interests, anything that might help us track him down. Eliza thought for a moment. He was private, rarely talked about his personal life, but I do remember he was an avid sailor. He had photos of a boat in his office, something with Orion in the name. Sophie's pulse quickened. Orion, the same name as the shell company where the money went. It's not just a random name, it means something to him. Walsh checked his watch. We have 10 minutes before we need to be back in court. What exactly are you proposing, Sophie? Sophie squared her shoulders. I need you to request a continuance time to locate Richard Phillips as a material witness. And I need the FBI to actually look at those servers without Blackwood blocking them. Even if the judge grants a continuance, which is far from certain, how do you plan to find Phillips? Walsh asked. Sophie glanced at Olivia, who had been waiting outside the conference room and was now peering through the glass, her expression concerned. I have an idea, but I need to know the FBI will actually look into Blackwood while we're searching for Phillips. When they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed subtly. The FBI agents were conferring in hushed tones, and Ms. Daniels appeared tense as she shuffled through papers. Blackwood had returned, but his usual composed demeanor had slipped, revealing an edge of nervousness. As Judge Harmon called the court back to order, Walsh rose. Your Honor, in light of the testimony we've heard, the defense requests a 1-week continuance to locate a material witness, Richard Phillips, former Chief Technology Officer of Meridian Investments, whose testimony we believe is crucial to establishing Ms. Miller's innocence. Ms. Daniels was on her feet immediately. Your Honor, this is a transparent delay tactic. The defense is attempting to create a distraction from the overwhelming evidence against Ms. Miller. Your Honor, Walsh countered. My young witness has provided specific, verifiable information that casts significant doubt on the prosecution's case. We simply need time to locate Mr. Phillips, who appears to have critical knowledge about the transactions in question. Judge Harmon considered this, his gaze moving from Walsh to Sophie to Blackwood, who was now whispering urgently to his attorney. Ms. Daniels, the judge said finally, has your team investigated the claims about this development server and the communications between Mr. Blackwood and Mr. Phillips? The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. We attempted to access additional servers at Meridian this weekend following an anonymous tip, but were met with legal objections from Meridian's counsel regarding the scope of our warrants. I see, the judge said, his expression hardening slightly. And does the prosecution object to expanding those warrants to specifically include these servers and communications? Ms. Daniels hesitated, clearly caught in a difficult position. If she objected, it would appear the prosecution was avoiding potentially exculpatory evidence. If she agreed, it acknowledged the legitimacy of Sophie's claims. The prosecution has no objection to a thorough investigation, Your Honor, she finally said. However, we maintain that a continuance is unnecessary. The FBI can examine these claims while the trial proceeds. The judge turned to Sophie, who was still seated in the witness stand. Young lady, you seem very certain about these allegations. What makes you believe Mr. Phillips is crucial to this case? Sophie straightened. Your Honor, the scripts I believe exist on Meridian servers would have required someone with high-level technical access to create and implement. As Chief Technology Officer, Mr. Phillips had that access, and the transfers to Orion Partners, the company where the stolen money was sent, were signed by a Richard Phillips. It can't be a coincidence. Judge Harmon nodded thoughtfully. Mr. Blackwood, he said, addressing the CEO directly, what can you tell us about Richard Phillips and his departure from Meridian? Blackwood rose slowly, clearly uncomfortable with being addressed directly. Phillips was a capable CTO who left to pursue other opportunities approximately 3 years ago. I haven't had contact with him since. Sophie couldn't help herself. That's not true, she blurted out. There are emails between them from just before my mother was arrested. Young lady, the judge admonished, you will speak only when questioned. He turned back to Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood, are you willing to allow FBI investigators full access to Meridian's servers, specifically those containing development files and email archives related to Mr. Phillips? Blackwood's attorney stood. Your Honor, Meridian is willing to cooperate fully with properly structured warrants. However, these servers contain sensitive client information and proprietary code that must be protected. Judge Harmon's expression made it clear he was losing patience. I'll take that as qualified cooperation at best. He fell silent for a moment, considering. Here's what we're going to do. I'm granting a 3-day continuance, not a week, Mr. Walsh. During that time, the FBI will execute expanded warrants to examine the specific servers and communications mentioned in today's testimony, and the defense will make every effort to locate Richard Phillips. He fixed Sophie with a stern look. I hope, young lady, that your certainty is well-founded. Court is adjourned until Thursday at 9 a.m. As the courtroom began to clear, Sophie felt a strange mixture of triumph and terror. She had bought them time, but not much. Now they actually had to find Richard Phillips, a man who had gone to considerable lengths to disappear. Her mother was allowed a brief moment with her before being returned to custody. Sophie, Eliza said, her voice barely above a whisper, I don't know whether to be proud or terrified. What you did today was incredibly brave and incredibly dangerous. Sophie squeezed her mother's hands. I'll find him, Mom. I promise. Eliza shook her head. Don't make promises you can't keep, sweetheart. Just be careful. Blackwood isn't going to take this lying down. As her mother was led away, Sophie felt a chill at her words. Until now, she had been so focused on uncovering the truth that she hadn't fully considered the danger she might be putting herself in. Blackwood had engineered a complex fraud and framed her mother. What might he do when cornered? Outside the courthouse, Olivia was waiting at the bottom of the steps, practically bouncing with nervous energy. What happened? I saw everyone leaving. Is it over? Not yet, Sophie replied. We got a 3-day continuance to find Richard Phillips. Olivia's eyes widened. 3 days. Sophie, we have no idea where he is. He could be anywhere in the world. We know he's connected to Orion Partners, which has an account at First Caribbean International Bank, Sophie said, her mind racing. And my mom said he was a sailor, had a boat with Orion in the name. Oh, so? What? We're going to search every marina in the world for a boat named after a constellation. Sophie shook her head. Not exactly, but wealthy people with boats leave traces. Registrations, marina fees, supplies? She pulled out her phone, and people like to show off their toys on social media. For the next several hours, Sophie and Olivia huddled in Aunt Patricia's apartment, using every online tool they could think of to search for Richard Phillips and any connection to sailing, boats, or the Caribbean. They created a timeline of his known movements, his departure from Meridian 3 years ago, the formation of Orion Partners LLC 18 months ago, the opening of the Caribbean bank account around the same time. Look at this, Olivia said, pointing to her laptop screen. I found a listing for a 47-foot sailboat called Orion's Belt that was purchased in South Florida 2 years ago. The listing agent was Bay Breeze Yacht Sales in Miami. Sophie leaned closer. Can you find out who bought it? Olivia shook her head. The listing just says it was sold. No buyer information. Call them, Sophie urged. What? I can't just call a yacht broker and ask for confidential client information? You don't have to. Sophie grabbed a notepad. Tell them you're doing a school project on luxury sailboats and want to know if they remember selling the Orion's Belt because you think it's beautiful. Ask general questions, how unique it was, where boats like that typically sail, that kind of thing. Olivia looked doubtful but dialed the number. To Sophie's surprise, the strategy worked better than expected. The broker, flattered by Olivia's interest and enthusiasm, happily shared that the Orion's Belt had been a special sale, a custom hunter with blue trim that had been delivered to a marina in the Florida Keys. He couldn't share the buyer's name, of course, but mentioned it had been purchased by a tech guy from Chicago who planned to sail it to the Caribbean. The Keys. Sophie whispered after Olivia hung up. He started in the Florida Keys. A quick search revealed dozens of marinas scattered throughout the Keys. Sophie studied a map, trying to think like someone planning to sail to the Caribbean. He'd want one of the southernmost marinas, she reasoned. As close to international waters as possible. They compiled a list of marinas in Key West and began making calls, posing as Richard Phillips, niece trying to surprise her uncle with a visit. I know he docks his sailboat there, the Orion's Belt, Sophie would say, "I'm flying down for spring break and want to surprise him." Most marinas gave them nothing, but the seventh call yielded results. "Oh, Mr. Phillips," the marina manager said. "Blue-trimmed hunter, right? He's not here now. Headed to Georgetown about 3 weeks ago. Said he'd be gone through April." "Georgetown?" Sophie asked, trying to hide her excitement. "Georgetown, Exumas. It's in the Bahamas, popular spot for sailors this time of year." After hanging up, Sophie turned to Olivia, her heart racing. "He's in the Bahamas. Georgetown, Exumas. Great," Olivia replied with a touch of sarcasm. "So we just hop on a plane to the Bahamas and, start asking around for a guy who stole $37 million. Sophie bit her lip, considering their limited options. "Maybe we don't have to go there ourselves. There must be authorities in the Bahamas we can contact." "Like the police?" Olivia asked. "And tell them what?" "That we're two teenagers who think some American is a criminal based on evidence we can't explain how we got." Sophie's frustration mounted. They were so close, yet Phillips still seemed beyond reach. They needed someone with authority, someone who could act on their information without questioning how they obtained it. "The FBI," Sophie said suddenly. "Detective Geller, he's the lead investigator on Mom's case. He was at the courthouse today. He heard everything." "You think an FBI agent is going to listen to us?" "Has to," Sophie insisted. "The judge ordered them to investigate. We're just helping them along." Finding Detective Geller's contact information proved surprisingly easy. The FBI's Chicago field office had a website listing key personnel, including Paul Geller, special agent in charge of financial crimes. Sophie composed a careful email, explaining that she was Eliza Miller's daughter and had information about Richard Phillips, whereabouts that might be relevant to the investigation. Within an hour, her phone rang, a blocked number. "Sophie Miller," a gruff voice asked when she answered. "Yes, this is Sophie. This is Special Agent Geller. I got your email. How did you get this information about Phillips?" Sophie swallowed nervously. "Public records and phone calls. We called marinas in the Keys pretending to be his niece, and one told us he sailed to Georgetown, Exumas 3 weeks ago on his boat, the Orion's Belt." There was a long pause. "You do realize that interfering with a federal investigation is a serious matter." "I'm not interfering," Sophie protested. "I'm helping. The judge gave us 3 days to find Phillips, and I found him, or at least where he was 3 weeks ago." Geller sighed audibly. "Sophie, I understand you want to help your mother. But this is work for professionals. We have international protocols, legal channels, which take time," Sophie interrupted. "Time my mother doesn't have, Mr. Geller, please. Just check it out. Find his boat, find him, and then you can see for yourself whether I was right about Blackwood setting my mother up." Another long pause. "I'll make some calls," Geller finally said. "But Sophie, stay out of this from now on. Let us do our jobs." "Will you let me know if you find him?" Sophie asked. "That's not how this works," Geller replied, but his tone had softened slightly. "Focus on school, kid. The truth has a way of coming out." After the call ended, Sophie stared at her phone, uncertain whether to feel hopeful or defeated. Would Geller actually follow up on her tip? Or was he just humoring her? "Know what?" Olivia asked. Sophie squared her shoulders. "Now we keep looking. If Phillips is in Georgetown with a distinctive boat, there have to be records, customs forms, marina fees, social media posts of the harbor." She managed a small smile. "And if the FBI won't tell us what they find, we'll just have to find it ourselves." The next day was agony for Sophie. She attended school as normal, though she could barely focus on her classes. Every free moment was spent checking her phone for news or continuing their online search for traces of Phillips in the Bahamas. By late afternoon, their persistence yielded results. Olivia found an Instagram post from 2 weeks ago geotagged to Georgetown Harbor, showing a line of sailboats, including one with distinctive blue trim that matched the description of Orion's Belt. The caption read, "Perfect day in paradise. Fair Exumas fe cruising life f Georgetown." "That's got to be his boat," Sophie exclaimed, zooming in on the image. "Can you find who posted this? Maybe they've seen Phillips." The photo had been posted by a couple documenting their sailing adventure through the Caribbean. Sophie crafted a careful direct message, explaining that she was trying to locate the owner of the blue-trimmed hunter for a school project on sailing photography. To her surprise, she received a reply within the hour. "That boat belongs to an American guy named Rich. Quiet type, keeps to himself. We've seen him at Chat and Chill on Stocking Island a few times." "Beautiful boat, Rich," Sophie murmured, short for Richard. Olivia glanced at her. "So he's going by a nickname, and he's hanging out at a place called Chat and Chill. Doesn't sound like someone hiding from the law." "Or it's the perfect cover," Sophie countered. living openly in a remote place, but with a ready escape route. The Bahamas has hundreds of islands to disappear into. Sophie sent another message, thanking the couple and asking if they knew if Rich was still in Georgetown. The answer came quickly. Saw his boat just yesterday. He mentioned he's heading to Long Island later this week. Sophie's heart raced. Phillips was still there, still findable. She immediately called Agent Geller's number, but it went straight to voicemail. She left a detailed message about their latest discovery, including the exact location where Phillips had been spotted. That evening, as Sophie was helping Aunt Patricia prepare dinner, the house phone rang. Patricia answered, then held the receiver out to Sophie with a puzzled expression. "It's for you. Someone named Agent Geller." Sophie nearly dropped the plate she was drying. She took the phone with trembling hands. "Hello. We found him," Geller said without preamble. "Phillips is in custody in Nassau. Bahamian authorities picked him up 2 hours ago at our request." Sophie's knees felt weak. "Did he say anything?" "That's not information I can share with you," Geller replied. "But I will say this: we executed those expanded warrants at Meridian today. Found some very interesting files on that development server you mentioned." Sophie closed her eyes, relief washing over her. "So you believe me now, about Blackwood? Let's just say the investigation has taken a significant turn," Geller said carefully. "Blackwood was brought in for questioning this afternoon. What about my mom? Can she come home now?" There was a pause. "Not yet. There are procedures that need to be followed. But I've spoken with the prosecutor, and in light of the new evidence, they're considering revising their position." "Thank you," Sophie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for believing me." "I didn't believe you," Geller corrected her. "I followed the evidence, which is exactly what we should have done from the beginning." He cleared his throat. "You took some big risks, Sophie. Dangerous ones. Don't make a habit of it." "I won't need to," Sophie replied, "as long as you guys do your jobs." Geller actually chuckled at that. "Fair enough. Get some rest, kid. Tomorrow's going to be interesting." Sophie barely slept that night, her mind racing with possibilities. Would Phillips cooperate with authorities? Would Blackwood try to pin everything on him? Would her mother really be exonerated? Thursday morning dawned bright and clear. Sophie dressed carefully in her most grown-up outfit, a blazer borrowed from Aunt Patricia over a simple blouse and dark jeans. She wanted to look serious, responsible, like someone who should be taken seriously despite her age. The courthouse was chaotic when they arrived. News vans lined the street. Reporters clustered on the steps. Word had leaked about Blackwood's questioning and Phillips' arrest, transforming a relatively obscure financial fraud case into headline news. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Blackwood was absent, but his attorneys were huddled with Ms. Daniels in intense discussion. Mr. Walsh met them at the door, his expression a mixture of amazement and professional satisfaction. "They're negotiating," he whispered to Sophie and Aunt Patricia. "The prosecution is considering dropping all charges against your mother in exchange for her cooperation in building a case against Blackwood and Phillips." "Is my mom here?" Sophie asked, scanning the room. Walsh nodded. "They're bringing her in through a private entrance to avoid the media." When Eliza Miller finally entered, Sophie barely recognized her. After months in detention, her mother looked both frailer and somehow stronger, her cheekbones more pronounced, her eyes clearer and more determined. When she saw Sophie, her composure cracked just slightly, a tremulous smile breaking through. Judge Harmon called the court to order promptly at 9 a.m. "Counsel," he began, "I understand there have been significant developments in this case since we last convened. Ms. Daniels, would you care to update the court?" The prosecutor rose. "Yes, Your Honor. In light of new evidence discovered during the execution of expanded warrants at Meridian Investments, the prosecution has substantially revised its understanding of this case. We have reason to believe that Alexander Blackwood and Richard Phillips, not Eliza Miller, were the architects of the fraud scheme in question." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Harmon allowed it to continue for a moment before tapping his gavel lightly. "And how does this affect the charges against Ms. Miller?" he asked. "The state is prepared to drop all charges against Eliza Miller, contingent upon her full cooperation in the ongoing investigation of Mr. Blackwood and Mr. Phillips," Ms. Daniels replied. "I see," the judge said, turning to Walsh. "Counsel for the defense, what is your position on this offer?" Walsh stood. "Ma'ams, Miller maintains her innocence and has always been willing to cooperate with authorities. We accept these terms and are gratified that the truth has finally come to light." Judge Harmon nodded. "Very well. The charges against Eliza Miller are hereby dismissed." He struck his gavel with finality. "Ms. Miller, You are free to go. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze for Sophie. After months of fear, detective work, and desperate gambles, those simple words, free to go, seemed almost unreal. Then her mother was standing, turning toward her with tears streaming down her face, and everything snapped back into motion. Sophie rushed forward, ignoring the bailiff's half-hearted attempt to maintain decorum, and threw herself into her mother's arms. They clung to each other, both sobbing now, as the courtroom erupted in commotion around them. You did it, her mother whispered into her hair. You saved me. I knew you were innocent. Sophie replied, her voice muffled against her mother's shoulder. I never doubted it for a second. Later, as they navigated through the throng of reporters outside the courthouse, Sophie spotted Agent Geller watching from a distance. When their eyes met, he gave her a small nod, a gesture of respect from one investigator to another. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Eliza moved back into their brownstone, and slowly, they began rebuilding their life together. The press covered the story extensively, the brilliant CFO framed by her corrupt boss, and the teenage daughter who had unraveled the conspiracy. Sophie found herself declining interview requests from national news programs, and even a few book deals. I just want things to go back to normal, she told her mother one evening as they sorted through the mail, which still contained daily requests for their story. Eliza smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind Sophie's ear. I'm not sure normal is an option anymore, sweetheart. You've had a glimpse behind the curtain, seen how justice really works, or sometimes doesn't work. That changes a person. I just did what I had to do, Sophie insisted. You did what most adults wouldn't have had the courage or persistence to do, her mother corrected. You believed in the truth when everyone else accepted the convenient narrative. That's rare, Sophie, and valuable. A month after the charges were dismissed, they received word that both Blackwood and Phillips had accepted plea deals, confirming the full extent of their scheme. As Eliza had suspected, Blackwood had been diverting client funds for years, using Phillips' technical expertise to cover his tracks. When Eliza had begun noticing discrepancies, Blackwood had promoted her to CFO specifically to position her as the scapegoat when the fraud inevitably came to light. The perfect patsy, Sophie muttered as they read the case summary Walsh had sent them. A single mom with no wealthy family to finance a rigorous defense. He underestimated one key factor, her mother replied with a smile. My daughter's determination. Life gradually settled into a new rhythm. Eliza found a position at a smaller financial firm, whose CEO made a point of highlighting her vindication and integrity. Sophie returned to school, where her story had transformed her social standing from awkward computer nerd to something approaching celebrity, a change she found both flattering and deeply uncomfortable. One afternoon, as Sophie was leaving school, she found Agent Geller waiting by the front gate, looking out of place among the uniformed students and soccer moms. Mr. Geller, Sophie said, surprised. What are you doing here? Thought you might like an update, he replied, falling into step beside her. We recovered most of the stolen funds. Phillips had converted some to cryptocurrency, but not as much as we feared. Most clients will be made whole. That's good, Sophie said. Is that why you came to find me? To tell me about the money? Geller shook his head. Not exactly. I wanted to talk to you about your methods. When Sophie tensed, he continued. Relax, you're not in trouble. The statute of limitations on whatever lines you might have crossed would be complicated, to say the least. Then what? Geller stopped walking, turning to face her directly. You have a talent, Sophie. The way you followed the evidence, made connections, persisted when professionals had given up. That's rare and valuable. Sophie felt a strange sense of déjà vu, hearing her mother's words echoed by this seasoned FBI agent. What are you saying? I'm saying that in a few years, when you're thinking about college and careers, you might consider giving me a call. He handed her a business card. The bureau needs people who can think the way you do. Sophie took the card, momentarily speechless. You mean, like a job, at the FBI? Geller smiled the first time she'd seen him do so. Something to think about, that's all. In the meantime, try to stay on the right side of those computer crime statutes, okay? As he walked away, Sophie stared down at the card in her hand, a future she'd never imagined suddenly taking shape in her mind. She slipped the card into her pocket and continued home, where her mother was waiting free, safe, and proud of the daughter who had refused to accept the convenient lie.